One of the most iconic parts of Until Dawn was the totem system, in which finding totems scattered throughout the game would grant you a vision of a possible future. Many of these visions were valuable clues, providing insights and forewarnings of events to come, and giving the player a hint of the choices that would grant the best outcome. But other totems were confusing or even potentially misleading, and some were simply extremely rare. So let's take a look at the totems, their associated scenes, and how, or if, you were ever supposed to figure out what was going on with them. Before we start, the first thing to keep in mind is that the totems are color-coded, with specific meanings to each color. This gives us a little additional insight, and I'll be referring to the totems by their type. As a reminder, the types are black, death, yellow, guidance, red, danger, brown, loss, white, fortune. So with a little bit more explanation on these, death totems show the death of the totem's finder. For example, if Chris finds a death totem, the vision will show a possible death for Chris. This is an important thing to remember because it distinguishes these from the lost totems. Lost totems show the death of a character other than the totem's finder. For example, if Mike finds a lost totem, it might show Jess's possible death. Guidance totems give a hint that might help you make the best choice in a future situation. The character finding this totem doesn't matter, this vision can apply to anyone. Danger totems give a warning of a possible future threat. The character finding this totem doesn't matter. Fortune totems show a vision of the best possible outcome of a situation. The character finding this totem also doesn't matter. As we go through, I'll mention the character who finds the totem if it's relevant. Otherwise, you should be able to just pick it up from the scene. Totems will be organized in the order that you find them in, and remember that Until Dawn is set up so that you can find all totems in a single run. Prologue. The first totem we find is in the Prologue, and it's a death totem found by Beth. The totem types haven't been explained yet, although there is information about them in the totem menu. Whether or not you know for sure that this totem foretells the finder's death, this totem wasn't really meant to be acted on since this is an unavoidable death. Chapter 1. The second totem is the tutorial guidance totem that we find with Sam on the way to the cable car, and it shows a bird landing on a picnic table and then flying away. This corresponds to the scene later on where Jess and Mike are having a snowball fight, and Jess has an option to throw a snowball at the bird. This is an important totem in a few ways. It teaches you to keep the visions in mind for later events, reinforces the theme of doing no harm to animals, and it shows that you sometimes make the best choice by doing nothing. Interestingly, this has a little bit of story behind it. There was a director's commentary stream where the developers discussed how they added this particular totem in specifically because later on in the game, when Matt is given the choice to attack a deer with an axe, players had forgotten that doing nothing was a choice. Adding in the guidance totem using this mechanic helped keep that possibility in the players' minds. Chapter 2. The next totem is another guidance totem, found by Chris outside the lodge. This totem shows Mike's hand being caught in the bear trap, but if you rewatch the scene carefully, you can see the corpse hand that was used to lure in the Wendigo. Therefore, this totem does warn you of what will happen if you touch the hand, even though it might be difficult to catch that. Lost totem. Chris finds this totem in the garage, and it shows Emily's potential death in the lodge fire during the finale of the game. This totem is well known as a bit of a troll, since it occurs during the quest where Chris is looking for supplies to make a mini flamethrower, and so many players believe the totem is related to that. Danger. This totem shows Josh punching Ashley after she stabbed him with the scissors. This particular totem doesn't seem to be of help in any sort of way, as the only way that this scene is avoidable is if you don't stab Josh, but there isn't any real indication that this is something you should or shouldn't do. Fortune. This shows Jess waking up at the bottom of the elevator shaft, foreshadowing her potential survival, but it doesn't offer any clues on how to achieve this outcome. Loss. The counterpart to the fortune totem, this vision shows Jess's possible death. Just like in the previous totem, on its own it isn't too helpful, but when you consider both totems together, you get some new hints. The lost totem shows Jess's jaw torn off, whereas in the fortune totem, she's injured but in one piece. With these two totems combined, you could potentially be very sure of whether or not Jess survived the Wendigo attack, and whether you might find her alive later on. Chapter 3. Danger. This shows the deer that threatened Matt and Emily later in the game, but there's no indication here of what to do or how to avoid the threat, so this totem is mostly useless. Guidance. This is the water wheel totem, which almost everyone finds but very few people realize how to interpret, both due to the vagueness of it and just how much later in the game it occurs. This totem is showing you, from a strange angle, what direction to go as Sam in order to find Hannah's diary, which is an essential part of getting the They All Live ending. Chapter 4. Guidance. One of the more iconic guidance totems, this one tells you to pet Wolfie, which allows for the formation of the best duo in the game. This totem can also just foretell that the wolf is not dangerous, and if you don't attack the wolf, you'll still get to team up later. Death. Found by Chris, foretelling his own death. This is one of the rarest scenes to get to see because it requires a few particular uncommon choices to be made, and so people typically don't get it. This totem is often very confusing and people really aren't sure who it's showing, but the fact that it's Death Totem tells us that it's Chris. This possible death happens when the group is in the underground tunnels late in the game, and it can only happen if Chris was left behind by the rest of the group and Ashley opened the trapdoor. Loss. This totem is somewhat related to the previous one because it shows Ashley's death if she opens the trapdoor. This totem not only gives no real hints about how to avoid this situation, aside from the possible clue that this is underground somewhere, but it's actually very confusing to a lot of players because Ashley's hair is for some reason in a low ponytail in this scene. Chapter 5. Fortune. This totem shows Matt standing outside a door to the mines, which happens if he escapes the Wendigo in Chapter 10, showing the best possible outcome for that situation. This is specifically the rare option where Matt is alone in Chapter 10 and where he chooses to keep running. Although the option to break through the door also allows Matt to survive, it requires a don't move sequence, so maybe this choice was considered the best despite the QTE. Strangely, this is not the very best outcome for this scene, because the very best outcome is the version that includes Jess. Loss. This totem is often missed because it's difficult to see, and it depicts a rare death for Matt. Even more interestingly, it actually reveals the Wendigo several chapters before they're shown to exist. Although you can get hints and quick jump scares early in the game, they're nothing like this totem, which clearly shows the Wendigo at the very beginning. This totem is the counterpart to the previous one, showing Matt's death in Chapter 10, although it's the same whether or not Jess is present. Death. Found by Mike, showing his own death. This shows Mike's death if he has to ignite the lodge during the finale scene, due to Sam having died. Again, Wendigo are shown just briefly, but because they're in the middle of the clip, it's more difficult to see them when replaying the video. Death. Found by Matt, showing his own death. This is a rare potential death that happens when Matt falls from the cliffside after attacking the deer and failing the following QTEs. It's pretty unusual to get this death, but it leads to you playing as Emily alone in the fire tower, and she can later find Matt's boot in the mines. Guidance. The controversial totem. To be fair, this totem does tell you exactly the right thing to do, which is to find the flare gun and give it to Matt, and even gives you a pretty good clue at the background, and so most players realize once they reach the fire tower that there should be a flare gun somewhere. The problem comes in because whether or not the flare gun is actually any use depends on a seemingly unrelated choice, whether or not Matt agrees with Emily's plan to go to the fire tower. If Matt disagrees, he pockets the flare gun and it's available for him to use to defend himself from the Wendigo later on. If he agrees, he fires the flare gun automatically right after receiving it, and not only is it useless to him, but it prevents Emily from using it in her own defense later on. Adding insult to injury is that there's no real reason to disagree with Emily here, since the plan to call for help is a perfectly good one, and so many people miss out on having the flare gun as an option for Matt. Fortune. This totem shows the best possible outcome of Chris's attempt to rescue Josh, which is that he returns to the lodge and Ashley lets him in safely. There isn't much to go on for how to actually get this outcome, however, you just know that it could happen. Chapter 6. Guidance. There's only one totem in this chapter, but it's a big one. This totem shows Chris putting the handgun down on the table in front of him, and it provides a massive hint as to what to do when faced with the choice of shooting Chris or Ashley. Although choosing to shoot Chris also results in a good outcome, this totem is showing you that you don't need to pick between Chris and Ashley at all, hopefully preventing people from sacrificing Ashley because they'd prefer Chris to survive. We all know how that choice turns out. Chapter 7. Death. Found by Emily, showing her own death. This totem shows Emily's potential death by being shot by Mike. There's no indication of how to avoid this, but when paired with another totem found later on, the player gets a clearer idea of what's happening. Danger. This is a very weird totem. Not only is there no indication of how to avoid this situation, it's not even actually dangerous. This particular Wendigo can't hurt Mike. It also looks like a ghostly arm phasing through the wall instead of a Wendigo arm sticking out of a cage, and even accounting for distortion from the bloom effect, it's pretty clearly coming out of the wall. Chapter 8. Fortune. This is the counterpart to Emily's death totem, showing Mike deciding not to shoot. On its own, this totem is very clear on how to get the best outcome, because shooting Emily is unnecessary, and when combined with the death totem, you get a fuller picture of the context, and so can better recognize the scene when it happens. Chapter 9. Danger. This totem shows a Wendigo attack, and indicates that there are Wendigo in the sanatorium aside from Hannah, but not how to avoid the situation itself. It also, again, isn't actually dangerous to Mike due to his plot armor, but to be fair, it is dangerous to Wolfie, who might intervene to protect Mike. Danger. This is the famous Josh as a Wendigo totem, showing Josh mid-transformation. It's interesting to me that this is a danger totem because this is an epilogue scene, so you don't have any gameplay in that scene itself. It could be interpreted as being a danger to Josh, in that this is something bad that could happen to him, but there's no indication at all of how to avoid this fate, and it's arguable about whether it's better or worse than his other fate. Loss. The direct counterpart to the previous totem, this shows Josh's death when Hannah attacks him. Again, there's no hint here on how to avoid this, and Josh's death or survival depends only on one thing, whether or not Sam finds Hannah's diary in the mines. Chapter 10. Death, found by Sam, showing Sam's death. This one is pretty clear. Don't be caught by the Wendigo. Not particularly helpful since that's common sense, and this totem can actually cause players to think that they shouldn't draw Hannah's attention away from Mike, which will lead to Mike's death. Fortune. The best possible ending, showing that lighting the lodge on fire is the way to go, but again, this one can be misleading. Players sometimes think that they need to set fire to the lodge as fast as possible and end up killing everyone still inside. Fortune. This totem is the counterbalance to the possible misinterpretations of the previous two totems, showing that it's good for Handigo to draw close to Sam while she doesn't move. This one hints that Sam should keep Hannah's attention and not move, rather than leaving Hannah to attack Mike or running to the light switch prematurely. Loss. This totem shows Mike's death in the lodge fire, similar to the lost totem found by Chris way earlier on that shows Emily's death. When combined with the previous few totems, this also gives more context and makes it more clear that the kids can die in the lodge fire, and that you need to make sure everyone is out before you flip the switch. Danger. Found by Sam, this is the last totem to be found. This shows the Wendigo invading the cinema room, foreshadowing that there will be Wendigo other than Hannah in the lodge for the final showdown. Interestingly, and counterintuitively, since this is a danger totem, this vision is showing the best case scenario of not locking the basement door. I recently saw a post on Reddit where a user mentioned realizing that there were differences between different Let's Plays that they had watched. When they looked through more carefully, they realized that locking the door actually does matter, and it causes you to have a longer Don't Move segment when Hannah is on the chandelier. If you don't lock the door, the Wendigo come up faster and you have a shorter Don't Move segment. Very interesting stuff. And there you have it. All of the totems, their corresponding scenes, and interpretations of what's in the visions and why. Personally, I think that danger totems are worthless in this game. The other totem types can be interesting, but they don't really give you a whole lot of guidance except for perhaps the guidance totem. I think that probably the water wheel totem, the totem where Chris puts the gun down, the flare gun totem, and the fortune totem where Mike puts down the gun. I think those are the best and most useful totems. The rest of them not so good. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed seeing these totems and what the actual corresponding scenes that they go with are. A lot of them are pretty rare. You don't actually see all that many unless you go on a rare scenes hunt. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video and thanks for watching.